Hey, greetings everybody. It is GleeCon coming back at you again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we ran through Westfall for the second time, this time kind of starting out from Sentinel Hill and doing a couple quests. Really, barely more than a couple. We killed a couple gnolls, we killed some Defius, and that was about it. Wham bam, thank you ma'am. We're 2 hours into an episode, so that's just how these classic quests go. On our last time looking through the books of the World of Warcraft Dungeons and Dragons campaign setting, the Horde Player's Guide, we've been in Chapter 6 looking at the history and the culture of the various races. I think there's going to be some other side races too. So we looked at the Tauren last time, and stay a while as we move on into the Forsaken with this episode. I almost feel bad for those guys. See, some years ago, the Death Knight Arthas led the Scourge into the forests of Quell the Lost to use the Sunwell there to revive his companion Kel'Thuzad. During the assault, he slew the High Elves' Ranger General Sylvanas Windrunner and turned her into a Banshee. Soon after, Quell the Lost burned to the ground. Later, Arthas sacked Lordaeron and turned the entire countryside into the Plague Lands, corrupting the Tristful Glades and the Silverpine Forest. By this time, Sylvanas had returned to her body as a corporeal undead creature. Also at this time, Arthas was forced to flee Lordaeron for two related reasons. His powers were weakening, and the Lich King sent Arthas a warning that the Frozen Throne was in danger, and commanded that Arthas come to Northrend as soon as undeadly possible. Ridiculous, silly. My dog is doing what he does. He's been chilling this whole time. Hey there, doggy GleeCon. Welcome to the episode. Sorry, he'll settle down in just a minute. I will get more professional one day. As Arthas' powers weakened, Sylvanas broke free of his control. Three Dreadlord brothers, Deathrok, Balnazar, and Varamathras, didn't like the way Arthas was running the Scourge. They thought they could do a better job and bring the Scourge firmly back into the Legion's control. The Dreadlords, knowing that Sylvanas had freed herself, contacted her and explained that the Lich King's powers were weakening, and so as a result were Arthas' powers. The Dreadlords proposed that she help them overthrow Arthas. Sylvanas replied that she might participate in their coup, but in her own way, and so she did. Sylvanas' Banshees, pretending to be Arthas' allies, escorted Arthas on his escape from Lordaeron. As the Dreadlord's forces drew close, Sylvanas appeared and launched a poisoned arrow into the Death Knight. The poison was painful and slow, and Sylvanas let it do its work, watching as her enemy's body failed. However, before the poison overcame Arthas, Kel'Thuzad and his forces appeared. The Lich rescued Arthas, and Sylvanas and her Banshees fled. By this time, Kel'Thuzad had made all the preparations for Arthas to travel to Northrend. As Arthas left, he commanded Kel'Thuzad to watch over Lordaeron and the surrounding areas which had become the Plague Lands. Sylvanas declared that she and her undead were now free of the Lich King's control. She immediately set out to conquer territories from the Scourge's three Dreadlords and won the Tristful Glades. Pleading for his life, the Dreadlord Varamathras earned the Dark Lady's favor and joined her newly dubbed Forsaken, acting as general of her martial forces. During this time, Varamathras' brother Deathrok bewitched the last human remnants in Lordaeron, including Grand Marshal Garithos. Sylvanas' forces freed the humans from Deathrok's forces, and she and her army defeated and slew the Dreadlord. Sylvanas and her forces then turned to Balnazar. The Dreadlord had fortified the ruins of the capital city of Lordaeron and challenged her backstabbing brother and the Lady Sylvanas to conquer the city. Understanding that she was not powerful enough to tackle Balnazar on her own, she struck a hasty alliance with Garithos, who also did not desire to see Lordaeron in the Scourge's hands. The Dreadlord was unprepared for the alliance between the Forsaken and Lord Garithos' forces, and Varamathras slew his brother before night fell. Lady Sylvanas then turned on Garithos and slew him and his army to the man. She declared the city as well as Silverpine Forest and Tristful Glades as the territory of the Forsaken. Sending amnesty out to all undead who had broke free from Ner'zhul's control during the assault on the Frozen Throne, Lady Sylvanas bolstered her forces, creating a nation and race of undead. Discovering the sewers under the ruined capital city of Lordaeron, Sylvanas rebuilt and extended the tunnels, creating the infamous Undercity, the capital of the Forsaken's power. Soon, however, Sylvanas realized that she was unable to keep her territories safe. The newly restored Lich King demanded that Sylvanas and her undead rejoin the Scourge, sending increasingly more aggressive assaults against her capital. Furthermore, a faction of humans known as the Scarlet Crusade declared a war against all undead in Lordaeron with the hopes of freeing the continent and restoring it to its former glory. The Scarlet Crusade was unable or perhaps unwilling to see a difference between Sylvanas' Forsaken and the Scourge, destroying her undead with the same fervor as they did the Lich Kings. Envisioning the fall of her race before she could achieve her ambitions, Sylvanas became desperate and sought allies. Sylvanas knew that humans were irrational creatures and would never hear out an undead ambassador. The actions of the Scarlet Crusade had also turned her people against the Alliance. Instead, the Dark Lady turned to the next greatest faction, the Horde. So, one, that was a recap of Warcraft 3. 2, interesting that they are referring to the Horde as the next greatest alliance. Oh my goodness. And 3, recently in the book by Christy Golden, Sylvanas, they've changed that narrative a little bit, which we read on this channel. So in that narrative, she did seek out human help first, and maybe that's mentioned in some of the other books, and I'm just not remembering. But notably, it does happen in that book. She does send out emissaries who never even make it through the gates of Stormwind. So it's not that she just automatically assumes. She does try. But I think we've read this other version of history. So I don't know if Christy Golden got approval or just took some liberties, kind of saying that this is read between the lines or whatever. Okay, the Forsaken language. Forsaken speak gutter speak. Forsaken characters receive this language as a bonus language in addition to Common. Gutter speak is a lower form of Common that uses very little bits of Dwarven and Thalassian. It has existed for a while, longer than the Forsaken have. It evolved in the shady underground of black markets and rogues guilds. It was the tongue spoken by people of ill repute. When the Forsaken took Undercity, they adopted Gutter speak as their official language. To sum up the Forsaken's attitude, we've been thrown away like trash, abandoned by everyone, even our friends and loved ones. Thus, Gutter speak, as the language of outcasts, seemed appropriate to the Forsaken. Note that Forsaken can still understand and speak Common, however, they never speak Common under normal circumstances. They take fierce pride in speaking Gutter speak instead. I don't know how I feel about that. As a Dungeons and Dragons convention, okay, I guess, to give them their own race, just doesn't make sense. As a matter of fact, it doesn't make sense why in general the Forsaken don't speak the language of the Alliance. They're all former Alliance members, so they don't speak Human, they don't speak Elven. That just is weird. The Forsaken sent, and I think that there's something we touched on in one thing, that they kind of forget their tongue and they have to be retrained to their new tongue. So maybe if you tied that into Gutter speak, it would help. The Forsaken sent ambassadors to Durotar, hoping that Thrall would receive them. Despite the destruction of some of her ambassadors, mistaken for vile members of the Scourge, her message got through. Convincing the Horde to accept them was difficult, but the Banshee Queen is resourceful. Sylvanas knew that the Horde needed the Forsaken too, and her formidable intelligence and skillful manipulation proved their value. She persuaded the Horde that the Forsaken had much to offer as allies. I don't know how, but Thrall bought it. Not entirely, though. Thrall and his advisor, the Tauren chieftain Karen Bloodhoof, had fought the undead for years and were suspicious of this proposition. I asked him one day why he did it. He told me that a council of sages known as the Earthen Ring asked him to. They claim that the Forsaken battle demons that Thrall's own race is still fighting to this day. To turn his back on the Forsaken was to forget the horrors the Orc race fought for generations. The Horde was also in a rough bind. It was not nearly as numerous as the Alliance. Azeroth saw aggressions against the Horde once again, even though Thrall explained isolated conflicts away as individual territorial conflicts and not racist aggression. He saw the truce between the Alliance and the Horde tottering on the verge of collapse. He also had no presence in the eastern side of the world, as he hadn't yet met the Revantusk tribe. See the forest trolls below. He needed the Alliance as much as the Forsaken did. Grudgingly, he accepted the Forsaken into the Horde. Sylvanas sent diplomats to Durotar and Mulgore to seed the Forsaken fully into the Horde. Likewise, the Horde sent an ambassador to Undercity to keep tabs on Lady Sylvanas and see that she pursues only agendas that benefit the Horde. Thrall and Cairn remain suspicious of the Forsaken, with good cause, might I add. Perhaps if they knew the truth of what the Forsaken were up to these days, they would order an extermination of their race, and to hell with how weakened it would leave them. Perhaps Thrall and Cairn already know, but believe the Alliance's benefits outweigh the possible consequences of forsaking the Forsaken. Recently, I heard rumors that the Forsaken have been talking with another faction. My informants tell me that they seek new allies. Whether this allegiance is for the Horde, or if the Forsaken found another even better ally, no one knows. When I went to verify these rumors, I found nothing. It's disturbing, to say the least, but I guess only time will tell what the undead buggers are really up to. What is this other faction? Interesting. Forsaken culture. Forsaken are a wild hodgepodge of different ideals and beliefs. No two Forsaken are alike, even more so than any other race. Even referring to them as a race is misleading, as they exist more as a state of being than a race. The Forsaken are made up of undead humans and the occasional elf. And let's answer this: why only humans? With the exception of a few elves, all Forsaken are former humans. Even the Forsaken don't understand the process by which they are created. The leading theory involves the power of humans' spirits. Humans are perhaps the most stubborn race on Azeroth. What about dwarves, I ask you? And fear nothing. Some scholars agree that this will to live extends even into the grave, thus explaining why more ghosts and wraiths are former humans. The unique nature of the Plaguelands combined with human resolve created the Forsaken, people who literally crawled from their graves simply because they didn't want to die yet. Of course, no one really knows, but they like to pretend they do. I would argue that the Scourge are more varied and should be all the other races as well. Then you could tie something almost like a disease. The Scourge, if it's like a disease, there's something about the human race that is just more genetically resistant to the disease on some level, not to stop them from becoming undead, but that allows them to be risen as Forsaken. Something like that. Perhaps the greatest element of the Forsaken culture and their culture's only universal element is their reverence of death. Every Forsaken respects the dead and damns those who do not. General society coddles new Forsaken like children while venerating those who are losing themselves to the Scourge, giving them the greatest comforts before they're put out of their misery. Forsaken treat each other with a measure of respect, as it takes a strong soul to rise and a stronger soul to not fall to mindless on death. More of this later. Arthas earns their greatest ire, as the Lich King shows no respect for the living or dead. While Forsaken create undead, they do so with respect to the souls and bodies they use. Life and death is a balance. The Lich King, however, enslaves the dead, stripping their free will. His path is an abomination to the Forsaken. There we have some orcs in the Undercity trading with the Forsaken, so that's kind of like the ambassador, as we mentioned in that picture. Most newly risen Forsaken have a difficult time adjusting. Old habits such as eating and sleeping are hard to give up, and many are simply unwilling to accept that they're dead. Violent rages and extreme cases of depression are prevalent among new Forsaken. Almost always a priest of the Forgotten Shadow greets a newly risen Forsaken. These emissaries ease the tension between life and death and teach the new undead the ropes. While the priest feels the new undead is old enough, he releases the Forsaken into the world to make a place for himself. While technically immortal, some Forsaken exhibit signs of old age, losing their identities and eventually their sentience. I met a fellow who reminded me of a dying old human huddled in his home in death knell. Feebled and scared, he complained about the cold growing within him and how he was starting to forget who he was. A priest explained to me that this creature was losing his mind to the Scourge and would eventually become a mindless one, an unintelligent zombie. All Forsaken fear this process, as it means they revert to the Scourge's will and lose themselves to the Lich King and his dominance. As I turned, I saw the priest draw a knife and slowly advance to the man. Perhaps these guys do have mercy after all. While many Forsaken are genial, few trust the living. They feel a bitter envy toward the living, and visions of their former lives haunt them. Furthermore, the living in Lordaeron and Kalimdor rarely understand what the Forsaken are, and destroy them as if they were mindless zombies. If it breathes, many Forsaken believe it's out to kill you a second time. Unfortunately, the Scarlet Crusade doesn't help. Between their assaults and the Scourge, the Forsaken have little trust for anyone. Perhaps Thrall actually can help them, in this respect at least. Since no two Forsaken are the same, their structures are never quite the same. Most Forsaken live in hovels they found deserted during the Scourge invasion, remodeled to suit their eclectic tastes. Let me give you an example. In Brill, I came across two houses side by side. One was patched with some sickly hides and reinforced with bones in the Orcish style. The other was reinforced in finely carved woodwork with extra levels built skyward. Reminded me of many homes in former Quel'Thalas, if you ask me. Mixed in between are the hellish buildings acolytes summoned to spread blight. In war, acolytes also summon structures, creating mobile fortresses and graveyards from which to summon creatures and strengthen their forces. While the Forsaken control most of the Tristful Glades and Silverpine Forest, the race is focused mainly in the Undercity and Deathnell. Here you find the undead's heaviest concentration, not to mention Sylvanas' underground throne. Other Horde races also have a presence here, with dedicated chambers in Undercity and an inn located in Deathnell, run by a rather moody Forsaken woman. I wouldn't eat anything a rotting corpse cooked, however, so like all intelligent visitors, I brought my own food. Not surprisingly, you won't find many living creatures in Forsaken lands, even their allies. While Forsaken tolerate other members of the Horde, that doesn't mean they like anyone with a breath and pulse. They remember the Scarlet Crusade's past and present aggressions too well and are simply too paranoid to trust anyone who hasn't died at least once. I'm perhaps the only living being outside of the Horde who's ever seen the Undercity, and if they have it their way, I'll be the last. While wandering Tristful Glades, I noticed at least three distinct groups among the Forsaken: the Dark Rangers, the Royal Apothecary Society, and the Cult of Forgotten Shadow. Sylvanas' Dark Rangers are a perverted group of necromantic assassins formed from the teachings of former Elven Rangers. The first Dark Ranger was Lady Hill Sylvanas herself. Sylvanas, after Arthas granted her undeath, soon realized that she was bereft of the powers she relied on as a ranger. Her aim was still true, her arrows still sharp, but, so the story goes, nature would no longer follow her commands. At the time she was still Arthas' servant, and she feared that she would be of no use to her king any longer. Speaking to several necromancers and assassins, Sylvanas learned the power of necromancy and curses and focused on the shadows more than nature. Soon she taught her newfound arts to other former rangers and created the Dark Rangers. All Dark Rangers are fanatically devoted to Lady Sylvanas, acting as her eyes, ears, and arrows outside of the Undercity. Okay, so again, that's a little off because even in Warcraft 3, by the time she has a corporeal body and becomes a ranger, she is outside of Arthas' control. So that timeline is wrong right there. I talked about the Royal Apothecary Society in an earlier manuscript, Lands of Conflict, but for completeness' sake, I'll discuss them again, as they are an important element of Forsaken culture, and also that was before they redid these books. That was the last book before the revamp into the World of Warcraft role-playing game. Until recently, necromancers were unheard of among the undead, more on this later, and the closest Lady Sylvanas had were her Dark Ranger's curses. Noting the alchemical prowess of the forest trolls living in the hinterlands and other wooded areas, she found a temporary solution and brought together the brightest Forsaken to form the Royal Apothecary Society. These guys' alchemical masterpieces are simply amazing. I've seen them bottle everything from healing potions to elixirs that raise the dead. The Cult of Forgotten Shadow is a more recent movement, and I'll talk more about them later on, and we also talked a lot about them a couple chapters ago. Suffice to say, their religion spreads like crazy, especially among Sylvanas' Dark Rangers. There's a certain appeal to a faith that preaches the ability to ascend to godhood, but I don't buy into it. I've seen a couple of odd Forsaken running around with powers that they shouldn't have, so some credence to this philosophy exists. Also, many of their roles in society are just like priests of the Holy Light. They offer comfort to grieving or young Forsaken, heal the wounded, and act as pillars of society. While some of their ideals are a bit questionable, they're rather decent folk for twisted undead. Okay, let's read a sidebar story about the Forsaken. Calisan stood silent as death, waiting his turn. It did not matter that he stood for hours while waiting for the Dark Lady to receive him. Undeath was amazing for patience and muscle fatigue, but the waiting was taking too long, and patience was wearing thin for the young spy. Calisan had discovered not too long ago a strange rumor that might threaten the peace of the Undercity. Small groups of Forsaken were seen consulting in corners, being called into special meetings. Secret messages were being sent out. Mindless undead birds carried these letters to their final destinations. All precautions were taken to ensure the secrecy of the messages. Each paper was treated with magics that would turn the message to ash in the hands of anyone but the intended receiver. Despite the odds, Calisan managed to intercept one of these messages before the self-destructing enchantments were laid. Unfortunately, the author of the message destroyed himself before Calisan could put him to the question, but no matter. He had the letter and the unsettling message written on it. Unable to contain himself any longer, he forced open the massive doors to Lady Sylvanas' antechambers and entered. Before he even set foot in, he spoke. "My queen, I have news of treason. Someone has been corresponding with Kel'Thuzad and Stratholme, leaking many of our defensive secrets, and I believe I know who the traitor is." It was then that he realized he had made a terrible mistake. In his hurry, he did not check to see if his queen was in the throne room. A pale, horned face grinned, showing sharp vampiric canines from Sylvanas' throne. The door closed behind Calisan, and a deep, haunting voice answered his call. "Is that so? Please, do tell more." And that's interesting, too, because I don't think the fact that Varimathras is going to betray Sylvanas is quite open, quite out there yet, but I think that will definitely happen within the first couple expansions. Old bozo out there, he's got a bone. There was a bone we gave him like months ago or something like that. He found it under the couch. So it's like basically Christmas in end of February here for this guy. As I said before, Sylvanas was bereft of necromancers. Priests of the Forgotten Shadow, as well as Forsaken apothecaries, have the ability to raise the dead, but this wasn't enough. Sylvanas desired her own necromancers to combat the Scourge's arcane powers. When she first broke free of the Scourge, she brought a small number of necromancers with her, but these necromancers either died during the battles against Balnazar or fled, fearing the Lich King's wrath. Recently, however, Sylvanas attracted several necromancers to her cause during hunting forays into the Plague Lands. Willing or not, these captured necromancers taught their arts to the Forsaken, and now the Dark Lady has a number of her own necromancers. This change creates tension between the necromancers and the Royal Apothecary Society, which believes that their usefulness to the Dark Lady may be coming to an end. If they cannot finish their master plague soon, they may find their society disbanded. While Lady Sylvanas is the queen of the Forsaken, she does not rule alone. The Dreadlord Varimathras polices the Forsaken and holds almost as much power as she does. I've noticed a trend among the undead. They seem to be split between revering Sylvanas and following Varimathras. I fear that the Dark Lady got a bum deal when she allowed the demon to ally with her. While she doesn't truly trust Varimathras, she believes that he is her willing servant. She may find out that one of these days she no longer rules the Forsaken. I don't look forward to the battle between these two. The Forsaken, for the most part, show complete respect and almost total servitude to the Dark Lady. The same, however, cannot be said about the Horde, with whom they allied only out of necessity. According to a few sources, who I will not speak of for their safety, the Forsaken created a project headed by the Royal Apothecary Society. The apothecary Farinel heads the project, constructing a new plague to wipe out all of humanity and the Forsaken's nemesis, the Scourge. So far, the Society has not yet produced results. Since the world at large refuses to accept them as people instead of undead, they will continue their dark designs to eliminate all non-Forsaken life forms on Azeroth. Whether time spent as allies of the Horde will change their opinion of who should live or die is yet to be seen. I do hope Thrall gets to them, however. I'd hate to have to kill these guys. Again. Alright, and let's look into the Forsaken knowledge as we have at the end of each of the others. What a character knows about Forsaken history and culture depends upon his intelligence and training, which a knowledge check represents. A hero makes an appropriate knowledge check, and if they make it, they know the following information about the Forsaken at the indicated DCs. So, anybody with even the remotest knowledge of Arcana or local knows this, and like half of people know it too. The Forsaken are undead creatures that exist in the ruined areas of Lordaeron. Unlike most undead, the Forsaken are completely independent of the Scourge, pursuing their own goals instead. Okay, so at the next rank, any adventurer with a decent knowledge of, about half of adventurers with a decent knowledge of geography or history know this, and a chunk, maybe about a quarter of regular people know that Arthas and the Scourge sacked the lands of Lordaeron and Quel'Thalas during the Third War, turning northern Lordaeron into the blighted Plague Lands. Only undead rule this area. However, the undead are split between the Scourge-controlled Plague Lands and the Forsaken-controlled Silverpine Forest and Tristful Glades. Now, very few people with a knowledge of history or nobility and royalty, and about half of adventurers or so, can tell this, maybe less than half. Maybe those that are actual skilled historians, even they have maybe about a half chance. 50-50. Lady Sylvanas Windrunner, the late Ranger General of Quel'Thalas, was the first Forsaken. Arthas originally raised Sylvanas to rule over his territories in Lordaeron and keep an eye on the Dreadlords there. However, when his power waned during the attacks on the Frozen Throne, Sylvanas used her anger and hatred to break free, taking many of the Scourge forces with her. She became the Banshee Queen and rules the newly dubbed Forsaken as their Dark Lady. Alright, now no regular people, but the most skilled heroes with knowledge and religion have a okay chance of knowing that former priests of the Holy Light lost their faith when they became undead. Lost and hurt, these priests founded a new religion based on a self-centered version of their former faith. Dubbed the Forgotten Shadow, this philosophy centers around self-empowerment and a desire to balance life with death. Many of the virtues and principles of the Holy Light exist within the Forgotten Shadow, but are twisted to an egocentric view. While small, the cult of the Forgotten Shadow grows in popularity, especially among Sylvanas' Dark Rangers. The cult claims Death Knell as its home, as well as a section of the Warrior Sector and Undercity, but it is not yet organized enough to claim much control over anything. And the most esoteric of Arcana or local knowledge scholars have a small chance of knowing that the Royal Apothecary Society, which is a sect of Forsaken alchemists, are fanatically loyal to the Dark Lady. Recently, the alchemists were assigned to a project to create a master plague, similar to Ner'zhul's, to wipe out the living races as well as the Scourge. However, at this point, their plague kills only humans and doesn't affect the Scourge at all yet. By the time we get to Wrath of the Lich King, that has changed. And that's, I think, when the betrayal begins to happen with Varamathras. All right, cool. So we got another episode in the pipe, 5x5. Thank you guys, everyone, so much for your attention. I hopefully you enjoyed it. Your patience with the dog and everything. I know, amateur hour over here, but I do greatly appreciate you, and hopefully you learned something or just filled some time on the ride through life. And I'll join you again for another ride through life on the next episode of Lore of Warcraft. See ya.